Hello and welcome to this episode of the GrowVC Everyone Funding Startups podcast. I'm your host Marcus, and today we're talking to Björn Lasse Harman, who's been responsible for highly valuable research in the startup space lately, and that is the Startup Genome project. But we'll get into that in more detail shortly. So Björn, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Marcus, thanks for inviting me again.
So yeah, it's been a while, but you were actually on the podcast back in 2010, so anyway, why don't we start off with a brief introduction to some of our listeners that may not be that familiar with you or haven't listened to that episode.
Okay, so my name is Björn Lasse Harman. I'm originally from Germany. I did a few mostly education and HR related ventures in Germany, in Russia and Bangladesh, and now in the US. My current venture is called Black Box. It's something that we started at the end of last year, so it's about 9 months old. The big vision that we started off with was inspired by the incredible explosion of entrepreneurship globally. Just seeing seeing all of these little hubs of entrepreneurship like Hong Kong, Singapore, Delhi, Bangalore, Chicago, Sao Paulo, Moscow, etc., and just seeing that there's startups all over the place. And also seeing that there's a massive impact of all of these startups, specifically technology startups in the US, where about 90% of all job growth comes from those startups. However, the failure rate is still at about 90%. And most of this failure rate is originated from self-destruction rather than competition, which basically means that most of these companies are committing avoidable mistakes. And we saw at the time that there were a bunch of different accelerators that helped companies to reduce this failure rate, but there was no real scalable way in doing this. And that's what we set out to do. This was our original vision. Let's try to find a scalable way to accelerate startups. And we kicked it off ourselves, being an accelerator, and then tried different trajectories and trying to make it more scalable. And one of them is now the Startup Genome Compass, which is a software that we built based on the research that we did.
So, okay, let's look at the research itself that you conducted. Could you elaborate a little bit on basically where you started out with the Startup Genome project and what you started looking out for in terms of the research?
So we started off with the research, just trying to synthesize the knowledge of different thought leaders and experts in the Valley, and also a few in other places in the world, and just try to sort of put all of these pieces together in a way that they actually start to make sense. And with these pieces, I mean advice, I mean descriptions of how you should build your company and what are sort of typical steps that a company evolves through, etc. And as a result, we created a first framework that we then started to test with first 50 companies. Then we expanded it to 650 companies, then to 3,200, and now to more than 12,000 companies. So, and each of these cycles was one big iteration for us in terms of methodology and theory, in how we analyze startups, how we predict success and failure, and what type of feedback we can generate for startups. And in this process of doing this research and trying to build up this framework, we've had a lot of different findings that we put in a report. There's 2 reports so far that we put out, and we see them sort of as a map for the territory. So they describe entrepreneurship for the first time in a very plastic way, where you can start understanding entrepreneurship much more as a process. So far, the reports have been downloaded more than 25,000 times, and there was a lot of interest in what we put out there.
It does sound like it got a great reception. I wanted to pick on something that you mentioned, entrepreneurship as a process, because to me it sounds, and looking at the project itself, it sounds like the startup Genome itself was run like a startup in a way. So was that a conscious choice for you, or was that indeed the case?
Well, I mean, we are entrepreneurs ourselves. I don't think we had a choice, let's say it like this. I finished my last startup, and also the rest of the team were all entrepreneurs. So when we started off, we didn't know exactly what we were going to do. We just had a sort of general vision of, okay, let's try to find a scalable way to accelerate startups, but we didn't really know where to start and what to do. And the research is something that evolved in the process as sort of our own discovery in trying to understand what can we actually do to help companies. And I guess the big difference from us to sort of traditional research institutions is that we did the research like entrepreneurs. We did it much leaner. We had much faster iteration cycles. Because of these fast iteration cycles, we had much faster feedback loops for ourselves in seeing what we should do better. And we had a lot of very good feedback that came in from scientists as we evolved. So that's, I guess, was our advantage compared to a lot of other scientists that have been working on entrepreneurship research for a very, very long time, but haven't gotten anywhere significant, also because they're obviously much more restricted by the rules of how they have to write the papers and how they have to submit them and so on.
Yeah, and I guess entrepreneurs don't really like rules. Through these iterations, you went through thousands of startups. Going through this data, when did you start finding the patterns? Were they immediately visible, or was it something that kind of gradually formed itself?
It's sort of been a process which is it's been both top down and bottom up. As I said, we initially created a framework based on synthesizing expert knowledge, similar to what Pandora did for music, and there's a number of other genome projects out there that have a very similar approach in the way of how they started, taking a very informal space that hasn't been electrified yet and start synthesizing expert knowledge. And I guess for us, the findings came evolved as we just tested this framework that we put together, and then as we saw that there's some things that don't fit, that don't make any sense, and we went into the data and tried to find specific patterns, and then based on these patterns, we would start evolving the framework. That's sort of generally how it worked in the beginning, and now there's a very smooth back and forth between these two sides, between just finding general patterns just based on like various different analysis techniques that we use, collecting more and more expert knowledge and trying to test whether this expert knowledge makes sense if we put it on the data.
Okay, so let's look at the patterns. We don't have to drill into too much detail, but from a high-level perspective, what were the main points and main findings that you took away from the research?
In terms of the patterns and sort of basically the key finding was around being able to predict failure and sort of being able to predict success, having the negative space of failure. But the key point is predicting failure. And the way how it works is that we look at a company and we try to evaluate the actual stage that they're in based on the customer response they have. And the reason why this works is because all of these companies are in an extremely high uncertain space, which means that the uncertainty is so overwhelming that it is impossible for them to predict what is going to happen over the next few weeks. They don't know how the customers will respond. They don't know who their customers are. They don't know who's their team. They don't know what exactly the right position is of their product. They don't know what are all the different customer segments that will appear, etc. They don't know anything. So we assume that that in general a startup is a search process, and that the actual stage of a company is determined by the customer response that they receive, which is described by the amount of users, by the conversion